What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and at the time of recording, I'm somewhere around 10 or so games into Pariah Nexus. So I wanted to record a little bit of an impromptu video to talk about my first impressions of the format and what you can expect when playing your games of Pariah Nexus. Now, all of my games are streamed over on Twitch. For those who don't know, I stream at twitch.tv/TacticalTortoiseTV most weekdays, and I'll be using those as a bit of B-roll for this video. For the most part, I've been playing what are essentially mildly updated Leviathan lists, but I've made some slight changes, so they aren't hyper-optimized for the current season, which can definitely change things, because there is a vast gulf in the power level of some styles of units. Most obviously, many of the utility units that were used in previous seasons, especially things with OC0, you talk about things like Ripper Swarms, Spore Mines, and Nurglings, those are significantly less useful. I'm not going to say that they are totally useless, and actually for the most part I have found them to have some utility, but instead of being an auto-include in many lists, they feel a lot more optional, which does feel pretty bad for those styles of units. There are some that will still survive if they have other abilities. Biovores, for example, the Tyranid faction will still be able to generate Spore Mines that can prevent enemy advances in their local vicinity and score many maneuver secondaries. Behind enemy lines, area denial, and engage in all fronts are still in the tactical mission deck, and most of those can be chosen as fixed objectives, and so having the ability to put these styles of units into these areas will still score you points just fine. You simply can't do actions with them, but they are still relevant for scoring other objectives. And if you have an aura like the Spore Mine aura that prevents advances, especially in a matchup like Orcs where the enemy is advancing towards you, or you have Nurglings that reduce the enemy hit rolls in melee by 1, those are still going to be useful, if not quite as much as the previous season. There is an emphasis on battle line units in this new season, but in my opinion, I don't think it's quite as prevalent as a lot of people have reported. I think it depends a lot on what mission special rules you get, since some of them can wildly impact battle line units, especially effects like Raise the Banners High that let your battle line units gain additional victory points over the course of the game are hugely important, but for the most part otherwise they don't feel particularly impactful. So I wouldn't go out of my way to include tons of additional battle line simply for the fact that Pariah Nexus reportedly has an emphasis on these styles of units. Now, I mentioned before that units that are OC0, not being able to score actions, but being able to score other objectives is relevant, and that does force another slight change in the units that you're taking. Obviously, the action mechanics of Leviathan have gone by the wayside, so the ability to fire in melee or advance and shoot your guns doesn't change where you can do actions on the table, and that dramatically changes how valuable keywords like pistol or assault are that would make you eligible to shoot when you're in those circumstances. Instead, units with a higher base movement characteristic tend to be very strong. So I think we are going to see a little bit of a shift to armies that are good at scoring taking multiple small, fast units rather than units that are cheaper but have the ability to advance and do stuff. So less scout squads and more jump pack assault intercessor squads out of Space Marines, for example. I would be surprised if we don't see 1 to 2 small units that can run up to an objective on the top of the first turn and deploy a teleport homer or cleanse, rather than the similar varieties of units that we saw in the Leviathan season. So it does feel to me like armies that have these relatively cheap, fast units are also going to have a little bit of a leg up on scoring. Now, list construction idiosyncrasies aside, the format feels much slower than the Leviathan format. In general, the primary missions score just about as quickly as they did in Leviathan, but secondary missions, at least for tactical secondaries, which is what I played in basically all of my games, score much more slowly. And you'll find that most of your games end at around 60 to 80 points per player, rather than the 80 to 100 that you found in Leviathan. And a lot of that is from those tactical objective scoring. A lot of these super high scoring limit objectives have been removed from the deck. Capture an enemy outpost, for example, has been removed. Bring it down requires you to destroy enemy units rather than individual models, and scores less on average on those those units. So even the turns where you get those enormous draws where you can complete all your secondaries to the maximum points level, you're only getting 8 to 11 points rather than the 10 to 15 that you could if you had gotten an absolute nut draw in Leviathan. This has totally changed the tenor of missions and has made primary objective feel a little bit more impactful, since the secondary score is overall feels like much less of a proportion of your total score. It obviously already was less of a proportion, since you can only score 40 secondary objective points and up to 50 primary objective, but the difference is that you are getting less in general of those 40 points, so your primary objective being constantly available to you does feel a little bit stronger. For that reason, and for the fact that there are many secondary missions in the format that require you to perform an action that takes a full round to complete, in my opinion, and at least how it looks so far, the format is slanted very heavily towards slower, more methodical, and highly resilient armies. That allows you to score a primary mission more often and be in a position, especially in a more aggressive position, in order to score the secondary objectives that you draw when you get them. On top of that, the secret mission mechanic has kind of changed the first versus second player paradigm quite a bit. In Leviathan, many players wanted to go second for the bottom round 5 scoring effect, and in some instances, while the first place player had the opportunity to determine the tempo of the game, the scoring benefit that the second player had was pretty attractive. In Pariah Nexus, the scoring benefit that the second player has is kind of overpowering. Not only do you have bottom round 5 scoring, but they also have the opportunity to secret mission. So in many instances where the score looks close, or the second player is a few points behind, they can slam in a secret mission, especially if the secondary objective is not scored very highly, probably take Unbroken Wall. I think generally speaking that one looks like basically a windmill slam, unless you are in a very specific situation where you can either score War of Attrition or potentially Command Insertion, but Unbroken Wall is very, very easy if you're in a position to already score the maximum on the bottom of round 5, which you should be. So the fact that if the second player is not tabled by the end of round 5, if they are scoring up to, let's say, 15 by holding 3 objectives outside their deployment zone in a mission like Take and Hold, and also representing Unbroken Wall to score an additional 20 on their secondary mission, they could score a 35-point round 5, not including any of their secondaries, which kind of allows the second player to not involve themselves with the primary mission at all until the end of the game. This forces the first player to push way more aggressively forward and try to alpha strike the second player and create such a tempo advantage that they're able to kill them before they get to this position where they can score a ton of points. And armies that are more resilient, like I mentioned, tend to have an advantage in these styles of games. So it feels to me like armies that are pretty skewy, that have good defensive characteristics, and have the ability to sort of play more sedately and play this slower game plan do feel a lot stronger in this format, more so than armies that are focused on scoring. Now, my heart goes out right now, and we'll see how the data slate update changes armies that are scoring focused currently, because as I've mentioned, the game feels much more attritional. You're trying to remove your opponent's pieces so that in the late game they can no longer score their secondaries or score their secret missions. And so the armies that are basically entirely predicated on trading models for points by throwing cheap trash units into the center of the table and converting them, either contesting your opponent's points or scoring secondaries with them, feel like they are going to struggle a little bit if we don't see any changes in the data slate update. Now, obviously, we are staring down the barrel of a ton of big changes coming down the pipeline, so I don't want to make too many sweeping statements about the balance of Pariah Nexus right now, because not only are we awaiting the Pariah Nexus tournament document for more balanced mission combinations, but we are also looking at what the data slate update is going to change. So there's a lot that's going to change in the next week or two, not to mention the fact that we're going to see the release of Genestealer Cult and Adeptus Sororitas rules in full, points values in addition to their rules. So the metagame is probably going to get flipped on its head before too long. But for these factions that are kind of very scoring focused, I am hoping for some big buffs to to them because it does feel like Pariah Nexus is going to be a lot tougher for them to play. Now, I guess in terms of a very basic first impression of the format, the biggest change was the change to that tempo, scoring being much more difficult and slower versus being a little bit more active in Leviathan. And so far, speaking totally personally, I haven't enjoyed that as much as I did in Leviathan. In Leviathan, the tactical mission deck felt like it was giving you a puzzle to complete. In many instances, you had to suss out how you were going to score your 1 to 2 objectives that turn, but they were always on the table. In Pariah Nexus, many of the objectives you will just discard out of hand, which is why New Orders is now unlimited in the format, so you can continuously discard many of these objectives. Although, so far, most of the times that I've discarded New Orders cards, I have then also been unable to complete the second card that I drew, so just burned a CP for nothing. At least it thins out the deck, I guess. So, I'm gonna New Orders out Marked for Death, because I can't score that. Cleanse, Extend. I can't cleanse either. Awesome. But for the most part, you are kind of white-knuckling through that card draw step, hoping for objectives that you can complete based on the board state currently, or if you get objectives that take a full round to complete, so things like Sabotage or Recover Assets that have a full round action as their requirement, you're just sort of white-knuckling through your opponent's turn and hoping that they don't kill your units. Now, I think that there is going to be a little bit of a paradigm shift in list building to try to make those objectives a little bit easier to score. You can have things like lone operatives in the early game that can sit just outside your deployment zone and recover assets, for example, and be very difficult to kill. However, it is very inconsistent, and if your opponent is in a good position to respond to those objectives, you might as well just discard them for command points when you draw them, rather than try to wait a full round and incentivize your opponent to kill your utility units, which they just will for the most part. The deck feels less like it's providing you challenges to work through in order to complete them for your turn, and a lot more random. Like, it's going to randomly assign you points values. And for me personally, that's been less fun than it has in Leviathan. Now, I do think that there is a little bit of bias. There is a lot of optimization to be done in list builds and unit archetypes that are good, and also setting up to score those objectives more reliably, but it feels much more difficult to do so, both from a sort of tactical and strategic standpoint, than it did in the Leviathan format. Now, before I sign off this video, one thing I do want to do is talk about some of the things in the format that I do really enjoy. The first one are sort of small quality of life changes. Things like Titanic units being able to count as multiple deployments, essentially, when you're deploying your army, to allow Titanic armies to not be quite as out-deployed as they are normally, and some cleanup to the general mission structure of the game definitely helps. I also love many of the updates to old objectives, things like Area Denial being not only slightly easier to score, but also just easier to understand, feels a lot better, and a lot of the objective cards have optional discard criteria, which allow you to, if you wish to do so, discard them during certain periods of the game, which allows you to get rid of bad cards in the early game when you draw them in a position where you can't score them. But if you're a fast or aggressive enough army, or your opponent has situated themselves in a position where you can actually score those objectives, allows you to come back and attack with them. The action mechanic being codified in the rules as well, and not being just sort of like a weird kind of afterthought in the Leviathan system, while it does wildly change the power level of certain units or keywords, having a condensed rule set and not just being a colloquialism and not being used to refer to scoring criteria that units can undergo in place of shooting, which would have been too much of a mouthful, is definitely way clearer and much nicer to play with. But anyway, that's all I have to say for this video. Just a short one to discuss the first couple of games that I played with the Pariah Nexus format. If you've played any games in Pariah Nexus, go ahead and let me know down in the comment section how those games have gone and how you felt about the new mission format so far. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.